Most people live their entire lives believing that weakness is something personal. They think it is part of their character, something they were born with, something that defines who they are. They describe themselves as not confrontational, too nice, overly patient, or not that kind of person. What they fail to see is that none of these traits appeared naturally. Weakness is not a genetic flaw. It is a learned condition, installed slowly, repeatedly, and deliberately over time. No one is born afraid to take up space. No child enters the world ashamed of their needs or hesitant to speak. Those behaviors are taught. They are reinforced through reward and punishment, approval and disapproval, praise and withdrawal. From early childhood, people are conditioned to associate acceptance with obedience and rejection with resistance. The lesson becomes clear long before it is ever spoken out loud. Fitting in is safer than standing out. As you grow, this conditioning becomes more refined. You are encouraged to be polite, even when politeness costs you honesty. You are told to be patient, even when patience turns into self-betrayal. You are praised for being understanding, accommodating, and easy to deal with, while rarely being taught how to protect yourself, assert boundaries, or demand respect. Over time, you learn that saying yes earns approval, while saying no creates tension. And since most people fear tension more than they fear losing themselves, they choose compliance. This is not accidental. Systems function best when the individuals inside them are predictable. A person who doubts themselves is easier to manage than a person who trusts their judgment. A person who avoids conflict is easier to exploit than a person who enforces boundaries. A person who seeks approval is easier to direct than a person who is internally anchored. Weakness, in this sense, is not a failure of the individual. It is the result of successful programming. The most dangerous stage of this process occurs when external control is no longer necessary. At that point, the voice of authority moves inside your own head. You begin to regulate yourself automatically. You stop yourself before anyone else has to. You silence your instincts, rationalize disrespect, and minimize your own needs before they inconvenience others. You start calling self-denial maturity and restraint wisdom, even when it is slowly eroding your sense of identity. This internalized weakness reshapes the way you see yourself. You begin to believe that choosing yourself is selfish, that enforcing boundaries is aggressive, and that wanting more than what you've been given is greedy or ungrateful. You mistake endurance for strength and tolerance for virtue. Meanwhile, the people who advance, lead, and dominate do not live by these rules. They were never meant for everyone. They were meant for those who were easier to control. Once weakness becomes internal, it no longer feels like a limitation imposed on you. It feels like who you are. And that is why it is so difficult to break. Because changing it doesn't just require new behavior. It requires questioning the beliefs you were rewarded for believing. It requires realizing that much of what you were taught about being good was never designed to make you powerful, only manageable. Once weakness has been internalized, it stops feeling like something imposed on you. It becomes invisible. It blends into your daily routine so seamlessly that you no longer question it. You don't wake up thinking, I am acting from weakness today. Instead, you wake up and move through your day, making decisions that feel normal, reasonable, even responsible, while slowly reinforcing the same patterns that keep you small. Look at how your day actually begins. Before you have identified your own priorities, before you have decided what matters to you, you reach for your phone. Messages, notifications, news, and other people's expectations flood your attention. Without realizing it, your mental space is already occupied. Your focus has been redirected outward before you've anchored it inward. This alone sets the tone for the rest of the day. Reaction instead of intention. As the day unfolds, weakness expresses itself through compliance. You agree to conversations you don't want to have because declining feels uncomfortable. You accept tasks that were never your responsibility because pushing back feels risky. You adjust your schedule, your energy, and your boundaries to accommodate others, often without asking whether those accommodations are reciprocated. Each decision feels minor in isolation, but together they create a life where your time is never fully your own. What keeps this pattern in place is not stupidity or lack of awareness, but fear. Fear of conflict, fear of being judged, fear of losing approval or being perceived as difficult. These fears rarely announce themselves clearly. Instead, they appear as rationalizations. You tell yourself it's not worth the argument. You convince yourself that being flexible is a strength. You frame self-sacrifice as maturity. And because these explanations sound reasonable, you rarely challenge them. Weakness also shows up in avoidance. Difficult conversations are postponed indefinitely. Disrespect is minimized rather than addressed. Boundaries are softened instead of enforced. You hope that time, patience, or goodwill will resolve issues that actually require confrontation. In reality, unresolved problems do not disappear. They accumulate, they deepen, and over time, they reshape the dynamics of your relationships and your environment. Gradually, a subtle shift occurs in how you see yourself. You begin to feel as though life is something that happens to you rather than something you actively shape. You become skilled at adapting, managing, and enduring, but less practiced at choosing and directing. You respond to circumstances instead of creating them. This is one of the most dangerous effects of internalized weakness. It removes the sense of agency while preserving the illusion of control. At this stage, people often describe themselves as tired, stuck, or unfulfilled without being able to pinpoint why. They may be productive, responsible, and outwardly functional, yet internally disconnected. The reason is simple, but uncomfortable. They are living according to patterns that were never designed to serve them, only to keep them agreeable and manageable. Human beings constantly assess one another, whether consciously or not. Through tone, posture, hesitation, and response patterns, people signal how they expect to be treated. Weakness sends a clear signal, even when wrapped in politeness and good intentions. It communicates availability, not generosity, but accessibility. Access to your time, your energy, your tolerance, and your boundaries. When you do not protect your time, others assume it is flexible. When you do not defend your boundaries, they are treated as suggestions. When you consistently accommodate without resistance, accommodation becomes expectation. None of this requires malice. It is simply how social dynamics work. People adjust to the limits that are enforced and exploit the ones that are not. In professional environments, weakness often disguises itself as dedication. The person who stays late, takes on extra work, and avoids pushing back is often praised initially. But over time, this behavior leads not to respect, but to exploitation. Their workload increases, their recognition stagnates, and their value becomes taken for granted. Meanwhile, those who assert their limits and communicate their worth clearly are seen as more serious, even if they contribute less effort overall. In personal relationships, the pattern is even more pronounced. Power does not belong to the person who cares more. It belongs to the person who is less afraid of loss. When one individual consistently prioritizes maintaining harmony over preserving self-respect, imbalance forms. Small acts of disrespect are tolerated. Standards are lowered. Justifications multiply. Eventually, the relationship becomes structured around one person's fear of abandonment and the other's freedom from consequence. What makes this especially damaging is that tolerance does not generate appreciation. It erodes respect. People may enjoy the benefits of your compliance, but they do not admire it. Over time, they begin to see you as someone who can be pushed, delayed, or ignored without cost. Even when affection remains, respect diminishes. And without respect, influence disappears. Every instance of unchallenged disrespect trains others how to treat you. Every boundary you fail to enforce becomes less real. Weakness compounds itself through repetition. It turns your silence into someone else's confidence, your hesitation into their authority, and your patience into their entitlement. And once these dynamics solidify, reversing them requires far more effort than preventing them in the first place. Strength, by contrast, does not require aggression. It requires consequences. When people know that crossing your boundaries leads to a response, not emotional, not dramatic, but firm and consistent, they adjust. They may not like it, but they respect it. Strength communicates certainty. Weakness communicates negotiability. And in every environment, negotiability is exploited. Comfort is one of the most misunderstood forces in modern life. It is often presented as a reward, something to strive for, something that signals success and maturity. People are taught that once they achieve a certain level of stability, predictability, and safety, they have made it. But comfort is rarely neutral. When it becomes a permanent state rather than a temporary pause, it quietly transforms into one of the most effective mechanisms for maintaining weakness. Comfort does not attack you. It does not threaten you. It does not force you into submission. Instead, it invites you to relax just enough that you stop questioning yourself. It convinces you that discomfort is unnecessary, that pressure is unhealthy, and that risk is irresponsible. Under the influence of comfort, stagnation begins to feel like balance, and avoidance starts to look like wisdom. The most dangerous aspect of comfort is that it removes the need to grow. Growth only happens under pressure. Skills develop when they are tested. Confidence forms when fear is confronted. Strength is built through resistance. Comfort eliminates resistance. When life becomes too predictable, the internal mechanisms that drive adaptation begin to shut down. The mind becomes slower to respond to challenges. The body becomes less resilient. The will becomes hesitant. Over time, this lack of pressure reshapes identity. A person who once imagined more for themselves begins to lower expectations, not consciously, but gradually. They stop pursuing goals that feel uncertain. They stop initiating difficult conversations. They stop putting themselves in positions where failure is possible. Instead, they choose what feels manageable, safe, familiar. This choice is rarely framed as fear. It is framed as practicality. Comfort encourages rationalization. When a person avoids a difficult decision, they tell themselves it is not the right time. When they avoid a risk, they say they are being responsible. When they stay in an unfulfilling situation, they explain it as loyalty or patience. Each explanation reduces internal tension, making it easier to repeat the same behavior the next time. Slowly, the avoidance becomes habitual, and the habit becomes character. One of the most corrosive effects of comfort is the way it erodes confidence. True confidence does not come from positive thinking or reassurance. It comes from evidence, from having faced difficulty and survived it. When a person consistently avoids discomfort, they deprive themselves of that evidence. Over time, they begin to doubt their ability to handle adversity. Challenges feel overwhelming, not because they are, but because the person has not practiced facing them. Comfort also distorts perception of risk. A person who lives comfortably begins to overestimate the danger of change and underestimate the cost of staying the same. They imagine worst-case scenarios if they act, but rarely consider the long-term consequences of inaction. Years pass, and what once felt like a temporary compromise becomes a permanent limitation. Opportunities that require courage are dismissed, while the slow decay of potential goes unnoticed. Another subtle effect of comfort is how it narrows a person's emotional range. Discomfort forces engagement. It demands attention and presence. Comfort allows disengagement. People begin to numb themselves with routines, distractions, and repetition. They may feel stable, but they no longer feel alive. There is less urgency, less intensity, and less meaning. Life becomes something to manage rather than something to actively shape. Eventually, comfort produces a specific kind of regret, not sharp or dramatic, but heavy and persistent. It is the regret of unrealized capacity, the quiet awareness that more was possible but was never attempted. This regret does not come from failure. It comes from never testing oneself at all. And by the time it becomes undeniable, the habits that created it are deeply ingrained. It is important to understand that comfort itself is not the enemy. Rest has value. Stability has value. The danger arises when comfort becomes the primary organizing principle of a person's life. When every decision is filtered through the question, "What will keep me comfortable?" rather than "What will help me grow?" strength deteriorates. The person becomes increasingly fragile, despite appearing stable. Every individual who develops real strength eventually makes the same realization. Discomfort is not a threat. It is a requirement. The people who advance are not those who feel no fear, but those who understand that avoiding discomfort guarantees stagnation. They choose difficult conversations over silent resentment. They choose uncertainty over quiet dissatisfaction. They choose growth over convenience. The paradox is that the more often a person voluntarily enters discomfort in service of long-term goals, the more resilient and calm their life becomes. Challenges no longer feel catastrophic. Pressure becomes familiar rather than overwhelming. Confidence grows not from certainty, but from capability. In contrast, a life organized around comfort becomes increasingly brittle, vulnerable to even small disruptions. Comfort offers short-term relief, but it charges long-term interest. Strength demands effort, but it pays dividends in freedom, confidence, and control. The choice between them is rarely dramatic. It is made quietly, day after day, through small decisions that either expand or contract who you are. And once you understand this, comfort can no longer disguise itself as harmless. You begin to see it for what it truly is, a test of whether you are willing to grow or willing to stay safe and small. Most people do not live according to reality. They live according to ideas that were handed to them early in life and never seriously questioned. These ideas are repeated so often and rewarded so consistently that they begin to feel like truth. In reality, they function as psychological restraints. They shape behavior in ways that feel morally correct, while quietly limiting initiative, authority, and self-respect. As long as a person believes these ideas, they remain passive without realizing they have made a choice. One of the most damaging lies is the belief that good things come to those who wait. This idea is comforting because it removes urgency. It allows a person to delay action without feeling irresponsible. Waiting feels patient, mature, and even virtuous. But the real world does not reward patience by default. It rewards movement. While one person waits for the right moment, another acts under imperfect conditions and gains experience, position, and leverage. Over time, the person who waits begins to feel overlooked, even though they voluntarily removed themselves from competition. Closely related to this is the belief that fairness will eventually correct imbalance. People tell themselves that if they work hard, stay quiet, and do the right thing, recognition will naturally follow. This belief discourages self-advocacy. It teaches people to expect outcomes without asserting value. In practice, fairness does not operate automatically. Visibility, negotiation, and boundary setting shape outcomes far more than silent effort. Those who refuse to advocate for themselves often become invisible, not because they lack merit, but because they never claimed their position. Another deeply embedded lie is the idea that everyone deserves respect simply by existing. While this belief sounds ethical, it creates confusion between basic human dignity and earned social respect. When respect is given indiscriminately, it loses meaning. More importantly, people who extend respect without requiring it in return slowly undermine their own standing. They tolerate dismissive behavior, rationalize boundary violations, and normalize imbalance. Over time, this pattern communicates that their needs are optional and their presence carries little consequence. Equally damaging is the belief that authenticity alone is enough, that by simply being oneself, acceptance and alignment will naturally follow. This idea ignores the reality that the self is not static. An undeveloped version of a person attracts undeveloped environments, relationships, and opportunities. Growth often requires shedding behaviors and identities that once felt comfortable but are no longer effective. When people cling to the idea of being accepted as they are, they may unknowingly defend the very traits that keep them stuck. Perhaps the most paralyzing belief of all is the idea that everything happens for a reason. While this belief offers emotional comfort during hardship, it subtly removes responsibility. It reframes consequences as destiny and turns inaction into fate. When people believe events are predetermined or meaningful regardless of their choices, they stop examining how their decisions contributed to their situation. Accountability fades, and with it, the ability to change outcomes. Meaning becomes a substitute for agency. What unites all of these beliefs is their effect on behavior. They promote patience over action, tolerance over enforcement, acceptance over discernment, and explanation over responsibility. A person living under these assumptions may appear calm and morally grounded, but internally, they are disconnected from their own authority. They adapt to circumstances instead of shaping them. They wait for permission that never arrives. Strong individuals are not free of belief. They simply hold different ones. They understand that action precedes opportunity, that respect must be maintained through boundaries, and that personal growth often disrupts social harmony. They do not assume fairness will protect them. They create leverage. They do not expect understanding from everyone. They prioritize alignment over approval. Letting go of comforting lies is not an intellectual exercise. It is emotionally disruptive. These beliefs often form the foundation of a person's identity and social belonging. Challenging them means risking disapproval, tension, and uncertainty. That is why most people cling to them even when evidence contradicts them. Illusions are easier to live with than responsibility. But the moment a person begins to question these ideas, something shifts. They stop interpreting discomfort as a sign to retreat and start seeing it as information. They recognize that frustration often points to unclaimed agency. They begin to see patterns where they previously saw coincidence. Slowly, responsibility replaces helplessness, and choice replaces waiting. Power does not come from rejecting all beliefs. It comes from rejecting the ones that reward passivity. When a person accepts that outcomes are shaped by consistent behavior rather than intention, they regain influence over their life. This realization is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. It removes excuses, but it restores control. The lies that keep people powerless survive because they are socially reinforced. People repeat them to one another not because they are true, but because they reduce tension. They make stagnation feel acceptable. But growth does not happen in comfort. And power does not come from reassurance. It comes from clarity. And clarity begins with the willingness to abandon ideas that feel good but lead nowhere. Most people believe their biggest problem is a lack of opportunity, support, or confidence. In reality, their biggest problem is the way they make decisions. More specifically, the order in which they make them. The majority of people decide emotionally first and then use logic afterward to justify what they already did. This sequence feels natural because emotions are immediate and powerful, but it quietly sabotages outcomes across every area of life. Emotions evolved to respond quickly, not accurately. They are designed to protect in the moment, not to optimize long-term results. Fear urges avoidance. Anger demands release. Guilt seeks relief. When decisions are driven by these states, the goal is not effectiveness, but emotional comfort. The person is no longer asking, "What serves me best?" They are asking, often unconsciously, "How do I stop feeling this right now?" And that question almost always leads to weak choices. This is where predictability forms. When a person reacts emotionally, their behavior becomes easy to anticipate. Others learn which buttons to press, which tones to use, which pressures work. Someone who reacts strongly to disrespect can be provoked into mistakes. Someone who fears conflict can be pushed without resistance. Someone driven by guilt can be manipulated through obligation. Emotional reactivity turns inner states into external control mechanisms. Calculation operates differently. It does not deny emotion, but it refuses to give it authority. Instead of acting from impulse, the person pauses and evaluates. They separate what they feel from what they need to do. They ask different questions, not, "How do I feel about this?" but, "What outcome do I want?" Not, "Is this uncomfortable?" but, "What are the consequences of each option?" This shift alone changes everything because it restores choice. Pauses are uncomfortable for emotionally reactive people. Silence feels like weakness. Delay feels like avoidance. But in reality, pauses are where leverage lives. The person who can hold their response controls the pace of the interaction. They are no longer being dragged by the emotional energy of the moment. They force situations to unfold on their terms, not the other person's urgency. Many people confuse emotional expression with strength. They believe that reacting quickly shows confidence and authenticity. In practice, it often shows lack of control. Emotional reactions escalate conflicts rather than resolve them. They create statements that cannot be taken back, and dynamics that linger long after the emotion has passed. The relief is temporary. The damage is not. Calculation reframes conflict entirely. A calculated response is not about winning arguments or proving points. It is about protecting position. Sometimes that means speaking. Sometimes it means silence. Sometimes it means withdrawal. The decision is based on impact, not ego. This is why emotionally disciplined people often appear calm in situations where others unravel. They are not detached from reality. They are anchored to outcome. This distinction becomes especially important in situations involving manipulation. Manipulation rarely works through logic. It works through emotion, urgency, fear, guilt, sympathy, or flattery. An emotionally driven person feels compelled to respond, explain, justify, or fix. A calculating person notices the pressure and asks what is being requested, explicitly or implicitly. They recognize that not every emotional appeal deserves engagement. Calculation also changes how people perceive failure. Emotional decision-makers avoid failure because it threatens identity. They associate mistakes with shame. As a result, they choose safe options that protect self-image but limit growth. Calculating individuals view failure differently. They assess risk in terms of information gained and leverage lost or gained. This allows them to take measured risks without collapsing emotionally when outcomes are imperfect. Another critical difference lies in time perspective. Emotions operate in the present moment. Calculation stretches across months and years. Emotional choices prioritize immediate relief. Calculated choices prioritize future position. This is why emotional decisions often feel good initially and bad later, while calculated decisions often feel uncomfortable initially and rewarding later. The discomfort is the cost of alignment. It is important to understand that calculation does not mean becoming cold, indifferent, or robotic. It means relocating authority. Emotions still provide valuable information. They signal boundaries, values, and desires. But information is not instruction. Calculation translates emotional data into strategic action rather than impulsive reaction. This is a skill, not a personality trait, and it improves with deliberate practice. Most people remain trapped in emotional decision-making because it is socially reinforced. Quick reactions are praised as honesty. Emotional displays are interpreted as passion. Calm restraint is sometimes misread as weakness. But those who learn to operate from calculation instead of impulse gradually separate themselves from this dynamic. Their lives begin to show fewer repeated problems, fewer chaotic relationships, and fewer regret-driven decisions. Over time, calculation produces stability, not because life becomes easier, but because the person becomes less reactive. Situations that once triggered panic, anger, or guilt now trigger analysis. This shift is subtle, but its effects compound. Better decisions lead to better positioning. Better positioning leads to more options, and options reduce fear. Ultimately, the difference between those who remain stuck and those who advance is not emotional capacity, but emotional governance. One group is governed by their feelings, the other uses feelings as data while remaining guided by intention and consequence. The first group lives in reaction, the second lives in direction, and over time, direction always wins. There is a moment in every person's life when desire quietly turns into dependence. It does not happen dramatically. It happens subtly, often under the surface of reasonable intentions. A job becomes more than a job. A relationship becomes more than a connection. An outcome becomes more than a preference. It becomes something tied to identity, security, or self-worth. And at that moment, power begins to shift away from the person who needs. Dependence changes behavior long before it is consciously recognized. The person starts adjusting themselves to protect the outcome. They soften boundaries, tolerate behavior they previously would not have accepted, and avoid actions that might disrupt the situation. These adjustments are rarely framed as weakness. They are framed as compromise, flexibility, or emotional maturity. In reality, they are signals of attachment that others can sense immediately. The problem with attachment is not caring. Caring is not weakness. The problem is needing a specific outcome in order to feel stable. When stability depends on one external variable, leverage disappears. The individual no longer chooses freely. They calculate every move based on fear of loss rather than alignment. This fear shapes tone, posture, timing, and decisions. Even when nothing is said, dependence communicates itself. Strategic detachment is the antidote to this dynamic. It does not mean indifference, coldness, or withdrawal from life. It means separating desire from identity. A detached person may want a particular result, but they are prepared to accept alternatives without collapsing. Their sense of self remains intact regardless of the outcome. Because of this, their behavior remains consistent under pressure. One of the clearest signs of detachment is the presence of options. A person with no alternatives is forced to comply. A person with options can negotiate, decline, or walk away. This applies across all domains of life. In professional environments, detachment is built through skill development, reputation, and network expansion. When a person knows they are not trapped, they stop acting like they are. In relationships, detachment manifests as standards. The detached individual does not threaten or manipulate. They simply know what they will and will not tolerate. If those limits are repeatedly crossed, they are willing to leave. This willingness is not performative. It is internal. And because it is internal, it is felt. People adjust behavior around someone who does not fear loss more than self-respect. Dependence, on the other hand, invites erosion. When one person is afraid to lose the relationship, the balance shifts. They begin to rationalize inconsistency, excuse disrespect, and reinterpret warning signs as misunderstandings. Each concession makes the next one easier. Over time, what began as attachment becomes self-abandonment. The person stays, not because the situation is healthy, but because leaving feels unbearable. Strategic detachment restores clarity. It allows a person to see situations as they are, not as they wish them to be. It removes the urgency that clouds judgment. When someone is detached, they no longer rush to fix, explain, or prove. They observe, they assess. They respond when response serves them, not when anxiety demands it. This creates a different tempo in interactions, one that naturally shifts power dynamics. Another important aspect of detachment is emotional containment. Attached individuals externalize their emotional state. Their mood rises and falls with circumstances and other people's behavior. Detached individuals maintain internal regulation. They may feel disappointment, frustration, or desire, but these feelings do not dictate action. Because of this, they remain steady where others fluctuate. Steadiness itself becomes a source of influence. Detachment also protects against manipulation. Manipulative tactics rely on urgency and emotional pressure. They work best on people who feel they must respond immediately or risk losing something important. A detached person does not rush. They do not feel compelled to justify or explain. They recognize pressure as information, not instruction. By refusing to be hurried, they disrupt the mechanism of control. It is important to understand that detachment is built, not adopted overnight. It requires honest self-examination. A person must identify where they are overly invested and why. Often, dependence hides unmet needs, unresolved insecurity, or fear of isolation. Addressing these foundations is what allows detachment to develop authentically rather than artificially. As detachment strengthens, behavior changes in subtle but powerful ways. The person becomes less reactive and more selective. They engage less frequently, but more intentionally. Their presence becomes calmer, not because they care less, but because they are no longer destabilized by uncertainty. This calmness is often misinterpreted as confidence, when in reality, it is freedom. Ultimately, strategic detachment returns choice to the individual. It removes the invisible pressure that distorts decisions and relationships. When a person no longer needs a specific outcome to feel whole, they regain leverage. They can pursue what aligns with them without fear-driven compromise. And in a world where most people are governed by attachment and anxiety, this form of detachment becomes a quiet but decisive advantage. At a certain point in a person's development, something fundamental changes. They stop trying to be understood by everyone. They stop explaining their decisions to people who do not carry the weight of those decisions. They stop justifying their boundaries to those who benefit from crossing them. This shift does not happen because the person becomes arrogant or indifferent. It happens because they finally understand where power actually comes from. Most people exhaust themselves trying to manage perception. They explain their intentions, clarify their motives, and soften their language in the hope that others will respond fairly. They believe that if they can just find the right words, misunderstanding will dissolve and respect will follow. Over time, they discover the opposite. Explanations invite debate. Justifications invite negotiation. The more a person explains, the more they teach others that their boundaries are flexible. Becoming the consequence means abandoning this pattern entirely. It means allowing actions to speak where words once tried to compensate. A person who has reached this stage does not threaten, argue, or dramatize. They simply act in alignment with their standards. When a line is crossed, the response is not emotional escalation, but decisive adjustment. Access is reduced. Engagement is withdrawn. Opportunities are removed. The response is proportional, consistent, and unemotional. This is where real authority forms. Authority does not come from intensity or volume. It comes from reliability. When people learn that certain behaviors consistently lead to certain outcomes, they adapt. Not because they're afraid, but because the environment has become